What's up? It's Marco, Sage of Soccer, and today I want to talk about a big reason why I'm a fan of the United States national team, and that's I really enjoy watching the rise of a team. I like watching them come up and really become a world power. If you notice, I cover Canada a lot deeper than I really have to. That's a big reason why they're a team that's on the rise. And another one that I've been really interested in lately is Norway. You might know them from all of the really good players they've got popping up, and I actually think that the US could learn something about player development from Norway. We've seen the rise of two of their youngsters from wonder kids to world class talents. We had Martin Odegaard, who was just an insane talent in Norway, who got a move to Real Madrid at an insanely young age, progressed through their youth teams, had a couple of good loan spells in the Netherlands and Real Sociedad, finally broke into their first team, and then moved to Arsenal, where he's captaining a Premier League charge. And then we have Erling Haaland, who what he was doing at youth level with his scoring is insane. Then he moved to the Austrian Bundesliga, actually played under Jesse Marsch, where he was dominant, moved to Dortmund, dominant, moved to Man City, record breaking. And we've seen those really good players come out of Norway. Norway lost to Spain yesterday, but they looked very good in that game. And if Erling Haaland was healthy, you have to wonder if they would have been able to win that game. And yesterday, their U19 team beat a stacked France team, and that all but guarantees their qualification to the U19 Euro. And if you look around, they have the two best players on the two best teams in the Premier League, and it is clear that Norway is a team on the rise. Norway has a lot of similarities to the United States as a soccer nation. Both have a ton of great athletes around their country, but not really the soccer culture to back it up. In addition, both have leagues that do not play on the typical European schedule, as the Norwegian winters are just too rough to play around that time. And both even have a very strong women's team, with the Norwegian side being world champions in 1995 and Olympic gold medalists in 2000. But the soccer culture has to compete with a lot of other sports in Norway. The popularity of skiing is insane in Norway. I've seen estimates that say that 70% of the entire population skis, and it shows because they are really good at it. It is the top sport in the country, and despite them only having a population of 5 million, they have been dominant at the Winter Olympics in a large part because of their skiing. And they have set records of 16 gold medals at the last Olympics. Like, that is stuff that the United States are doing, setting records at the Summer Olympics, Norway setting records at the Winter Olympics. So there are clearly athletes in Norway. And like the United States, Norway's soccer culture is growing. In fact, due to how many different classifications of skiing there are, soccer is technically the most popular sport by participation in Norway. And that is just huge good news. But similar to the United States, despite how many good athletes they have, despite their great showings at stuff like the Olympics, they haven't been able to translate that into a top national team. Norway was at its best during the 90s, where they had a very strong team notable for beating Brazil twice, including during the 1998 World Cup. They're led by Tor Andre Flo and Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, and they had a strong team that even made the knockout round of the World Cup in that 1998 year. But the success was not maintained, and they haven't qualified for a major tournament since 2000. But you have to imagine that will change at the upcoming Euro, as Norway are led, as I mentioned before, by Martin Odegaard, the creative captain of Arsenal, and Erling Haaland, who is just a world class player. And I think Martin Odegaard and Erling Haaland would get into any national team around the world. Haaland, in particular, with this combination of size, athleticism, and goal scoring talent, makes him such a unique player that we haven't seen before. But the thing is, he's not really that unique of a talent when you look at Norway. Alexander Sorloth and Jurgen Strand Larsen are two huge strikers at 6'4" and 6'5", who are also dynamic athletes. But like Holland, they also have strong technical ability to back it up. Unlike Holland, however, they aren't the insane goal scorers at a top five league like he is, though Sorloth has been playing pretty well for Sociedad recently. But it speaks to the type of athlete that Norway is bringing in and them being able to turn those athletes into those amazing soccer players. The United States, sure, we have a Daryl DK come through every now and then, but we haven't really been able to turn one of our more dynamic athletes into that technical striker who can play in a great team and really get the best out of those talents like we have in other sports. And I want to take a look at how Norway is able to do this. I wanted to take a look at Erling Haaland first. I'll talk about Martin Odegaard a little bit later, but for Haaland, he is a 6'5" freak of nature who I think would be an elite athlete at any sport he put his mind to. He's the type of player that we think of when we think of the potential of the United States being able to turn our amazing athletes into those top strikers. Now, Holland, his father was a former player, one who is pretty famous and did reach the heights of the Premier League. So he had a very good environment to start things off. Something that I found when looking at Holland's development is that he was actually a pretty late bloomer. He only started really growing when he turned 14, so despite him playing up a year because he was a very good talent, he wasn't able to dominate with his size and strength like a lot of other players who are huge could have. Holland did have to learn the more technical side of the game. He had to develop his movement, his finishing, his technical ability, all of that to make sure he could continue to dominate without having his size. And then when he did start to grow and he did turn into that elite athlete, he went pro at 15. And I think that pro part is what we should be focusing on. Because when we look around leagues like MLS, we can see that we are integrating a lot more younger players, but we're not giving these guys opportunities to become regulars in the first team at such a young age. Now, it is a lot easier in Norway because the league is much worse than MLS. I'd actually compare it more to the USL, where we do have some really young players becoming regulars in their squad, including guys like Caleb Wiley back when he was playing in Atlanta United 2 when they were in the USL. He was real. I think that really helped out his development. But with the introduction of MLS Next Pro and getting teams out of USL, I think that is hurting our development. I think that is something that we can learn from Norway. Norway did have to start integrating a lot more younger players into their team as the financial crisis of 2009 actually hurt their ability to be able to bring in players. So, with them trusting their youth, with them not having that great of a league to begin with, it's giving them a good environment to develop. And once they start to get good, clubs can come in and sign them away. And we have seen that style of development work. We have seen Alexander Sorloth and Jorgen Strand Larsen replicate Erling Haaland's success as well. And I think that we've seen them be able to turn their freak of nature athletes into talented soccer players. And both of those players would probably be the starting striker for the U.S. national team, at least before we bring in Balogun, hopefully. And I think that's really interesting to talk about how Norway was able to do that with their strikers. Now, we also have Martin Odegaard, who came through as a world class talent, but I think there's a bit less to learn from his case. Martin Odegaard is somebody who is, in my opinion, a world class player. And when we look at his development, he's somebody who is the son of a former player in the 90s when Norway was at its best, who fell in love with the game. He was able to go to training facilities as much as possible. His father was able to drill in ball skills to him, and he had an insane work ethic that really allowed him to get to the top. And he was such a talented player that Real Madrid signed him at a really young age. He made his pro debut at a young age, like I mentioned with Erling Haaland. And I think that Martin Odegaard is an amazing player who is world class, is probably going to go down as an all time great, but I don't think there's as much to learn about him. The United States is reaching the point where we are having second generation players start to enter the fold. Guys like Pulisic and Giovanni Reina had parents who were huge fans of the game. And I think that we're going to start getting players who have those ball skills, who have that technical ability. And if we look at our U20 team, our U17 squad, there's a lot of really talented technical players. And I'll be honest, I think we're just kind of due to get somebody like Martin Odegaard. Now, there are some other factors that might limit us. I think just being able to pick up a ball and go play with their friends is something that a lot of players don't have access to do outside of schools or practices. But when I look at Martin Odegaard's story, I think that we're due to get a player like him. I think Giovanni Reina has the potential. It's probably not going to be as good as Martin Odegaard. I don't think he's going to get to a world class level, but he's very close. Christian Pulisic is very close. Honestly, if we look at somebody like a Giuseppe Rossi, who we often forget about, he was very close if he stayed healthy. And maybe I'm just being optimistic, but I think that part of our development is good, and I think that we are going to be able to develop those players like Martin Odegaard that Norway has. I mean, because when you look at it, we are a better team than Norway. While I'm not completely sure who would win a game strictly due to the talents of an Erling Haaland and a Martin Odegaard on the field, we have much more depth as a nation. That is partially to be expected as we have over 60 times the population of Norway. But I really like our player development, and I think if we did a combined 11, it'd probably be 7 players from the United States at the lowest, I think. But Norway does have a pretty good squad, and I do want to talk about them a little bit before we end it off. In goal, Norway has a pretty big issue, actually. Now that Arstein is well past his prime and not a goalkeeper for Norway anymore, it is a glaring weakness of the squad. Nyland at RB Leipzig is a talented player who has gotten Premier League minutes in the past, but he's just riding the bench at the moment. Karlstrom is a talented player in Norway who's a 6'7" goalkeeper who's actually pretty good with the ball at his feet, who might be able to do something, but I think they're really hoping that Nyland can start to play a lot more because that goalkeeper position is actually a pretty big weakness for Norway. I think Norway's defense is starting to come together. Christopher Ayer has been a good defender for Brentford when he's been healthy. He looks like a solid Premier League level player, which is very hard to come by. Then you have Leo Ostergaard, who's been a bit part player for Napoli this season. He's certainly in a good place to develop, and I'm expecting him to get a lot more playing time next year because that Napoli team's going to get picked apart. Then you have Julian Ryerson, who's been strong for Borussia Dortmund since signing from him. He's been a solid player before that as well, but he's looked like he can handle himself in a Champions League level club. Then at left back, you have a guy like Melling, who's in France, but he's one of the more older players on this defense. And when you look to a guy who's on the rise, who might still be in the squad by the time the 2026 World Cup comes around, you have Leo Yelde, who's and Leeds United, he's on loan at Rotherham, and he's turned himself into a solid championship level defender who's at only 19. And I think he's somebody to watch for the future. And I think that Norwegian defense could be a pretty solid group if they're able to stay healthy. Norway's midfield is coming together very well, aside from Martin Odegaard, who's a world class talent. You have Frederick Arsnes, who's playing for Benfica, and he brings a ton of energy, just somebody who has an engine, won't stop running, and has proven himself to be a good player on a team that's challenging for the Champions League this year. That Benfica team is very good, and he's a big part of that squad. Good technical midfielder. I mentioned all the energy that he brings. He's another one of these just great players at Norway. I'd argue that he's their third best player at the moment. Then you have other players who do a good job of that defensive midfield role. Sander Berge is a guy who I've been a big fan of at Sheffield United. I think that he's a bit inconsistent at the moment, but he's another huge guy from Norway, 6'5". He does have that technical ability though, and I think he has a lot of energy to provide to this team, a lot of good connecting play, and I think he's somebody who could be a building block. And Sheffield look like they're going to get promoted this season, so he should be back in the Premier League. And then you have a Patrick Berg, who I think is kind of like their Jordan Morris, where very talented player, but I'm not sure if he's going to end up leaving Norway. I think that he has a ton of potential, but I'm not sure if he's going to end up fulfilling it. So I'd be more focusing on Sanderberger, Arsnes, and Odegaard as the midfield moving into the future. The wide talent is coming together for Norway as well. Mohamed El Noesi is more of a veteran player, but he's proven himself to be a Premier League level player. Then you have Ola Solbakken, who's been very good for Roma as of late. He's able to score some goals for them, and being able to prove himself to Jose Mourinho as a young player does mean a little bit. Then you have two wonder kids who are part of that U19 Norway team who beat France. Andreas Schjelderup, who's now at Benfica. He was one of the top players in the Danish league, the top scorer, in fact, when he left, and he seems to be a wonder kid. Antonio Nusa, he's gotten Champions League minutes as a very young player. He scored the game-winning goal for Norway in that game against France, and I think that he looks like an extremely good player, and wide talent for Norway is looking very good. And Solbakken's even a left-footed attacker, so I think that he's a real option, and this Norway team looks very good. And I mentioned up top already, Erling Haaland, Storloff, Strand Larsen, they don't have anything to worry about in their goal scoring department. Overall, Norway is a very fun team that's on the rise, have a couple of world-class players, and have a lot of good talents coming through. And I'm really excited to see them in European qualifying. I think that they'll be able to make the Euro this year, and honestly, they could be a dark horse at the upcoming 2026 World Cup and a team that we should be looking out for. Then in terms of developing players, I think we could learn a little bit about just integrating these young, just freak of nature strikers into teams as quickly as possible, having them play up as many age groups as they can without being unreasonable. And while it does come down to us getting those athletes to play soccer, I think we do have a lot of those players, and it's just about getting the best out of them and make them stronger players. And I think we could learn a bit of Norway from that, and maybe they could learn a bit from us about developing goalkeepers because we definitely have them beat in that regard. And as I mentioned before, I do think that we are the better team. In terms of how an actual game would go, who knows? Because Holland, he's just a difference maker. Martin Odegaard, great player as well. But I think that's a very fun team to watch. I'll be looking at them, and yeah, that's all I got to talk about. See you.